Nice to see everyone. My name is Bryn Lloyd Evans, as Sonia says. So I'm an academic social worker working in the Division of Psychiatry at UCL. And I'm going to do a brief talk trying to give a sort of overview, or at least a flavour of where sort of research is at and some of the issues about socially focused approaches to addressing loneliness for people with severe mental health problems. And then I'm going to hand over to a couple of colleagues who we work together on the Community Navigator study, who can hopefully try and bring this to life a bit by giving an example of a specific socially focused program for loneliness, which was about trying to support people with severe depression or anxiety in secondary mental health care. So just to sort of start off, I think it's acknowledging that there are different ways of trying to sort of tackle loneliness and social isolation. And a colleague of ours at UCL, Farhan Mann, produces quite helpful typology of different ways that range from things that are really focused on trying to change thoughts or behaviour for individuals, so changing cognition, social skills training, to at the other end of the spectrum, really addressing whole communities and trying to make communities more welcoming and connected places. And the bit I'm going to focus on today is the bit in the middle here about supported socialisation, which really is working with individuals, but trying to give quite practical help to help people find spaces, opportunities, meet new people with which to sort of develop social relationships and connections. So that's going to be the focus of what I'm talking about. What do we know so far? First of all, just to sort of think about what do we know about which of these approaches or which ways of working might have most promise or most evidence behind them at the moment. And I think a kind of short answer to that question is not too much. So I've put a table here from a recent review by a colleague of ours, Raymond Ma, who's a member of this network. So a systematic review that was published last year that looked at approaches for both subjective social isolation, so that would include loneliness and perceived social support, and objective isolation as well. And I think what you can see here is that there haven't been too many trials, certainly when you consider to either sort of psychological approaches, so family work or individual therapy, or to other sort of social things like trials about employment support. There's not a lot in loneliness. So this is a real under-researched field where we need to know more. Of the trials that have been done, not all of them have been about people with severe mental health problems, and not most of them, in fact, haven't found positive results. So there really is, I think, a kind of clear field out here, a kind of fairly blank piece of paper for thinking what might work. And I would just like to sort of kick back against one sort of assertion that's cropped up in a number of reviews. So I've quoted 3 here, all of which sort of single out cognitive approaches to addressing loneliness as the most promising approaches in a mental health context. And I guess I just don't see that from looking at this data from Raymond's review here, that actually for most approaches we need more evidence, and it's not looking amazingly promising what we've got at the moment. So as I say, I think there's a fairly open book that we just need to find out quite a lot more. There's a lot more work to do about what might be helpful ways to help people. Okay, I think there are some reasons to sort of worry about, is a sort of purely practical, socially focused approach going to be a helpful way of helping people? And I think, first of all, we know that kind of loneliness is not the same thing as objective social isolation, and we have reason to sort of worry that just getting people to do more stuff with people is not necessarily going to be the answer to addressing loneliness or helping people feel more connected. And indeed, there have been studies, so I've quoted the Fowler study here, which just had massively impressive increases in people's sort of social contact, but it didn't seem to lead to changes in how well off people felt, how happy people were, or how healthy. And I think we know both from theory and experimental work that people's thinking about their social worlds is really important for kind of perceptions of loneliness. So how much threat you perceive from other people and levels of social anxiety. And that's the sort of thing that I guess psychological approaches are very head-on trying to sort of tackle, which is obviously a sort of promising way to go about things. But having said that, I think there are some real promising sort of aspects of more socially focused approaches to balance against that. So loneliness and objective social isolation are not the same thing, but they are moderately correlated. And I think a number of studies, 2 of which I've put in here, have shown really quite strong correlations. And so there is some reason to think that if you can help get people with more social contact, you might help with loneliness certainly in some circumstances. I think we know, and the Community Navigator study that we'll talk about certainly found this, that there are practical barriers to social interaction that actually can in principle be reasonably easily addressed. So if somebody's got no money to go out and do things, that can be addressed. if people don't have transport links, if people just don't know where to go to pursue an interest they may have, then that's all information and resources that can be provided. And another recent study done by one of our colleagues at UCL, Khulud Al-Azmawi, was about looking at kind of factors that were associated in loneliness in a mixed population of people with severe mental health problems in secondary care. And the strongest kind of association she found was about experienced stigma. And I think certainly from the qualitative work that backed this up, it wasn't that this was all in people's heads, that there's a reality of kind of discriminatory and hostile views to people with mental health problems that can intersect with other forms of discrimination as well for some people, that actually can make it just quite hard for people to find their place and to have fulfilling social relationships, and support with people to find kind of perhaps more accepting and friendly kind of communities and groups and people might be struggling to sort of interact with at the moment could be a really helpful way to reduce loneliness. And the last point I'd like to propose here, and it'd be good to hear what people think about this, is that actually, while there's a big cognitive aspect to loneliness, the way we think about our social worlds is important for loneliness, actually changing social approaches and changing people's environment or people's activities can be a really helpful way to lead to cognitive change that can help with loneliness. And I'm going to give you just a couple of example quotes from the Community Navigators project that I've talked about. So take a quick moment to have a look at these. I think the first one here is really somebody talking about their own identity and regaining identities as an artist, having been felt a bit boxed into a sort of illness identity for a while. And the second one there is really somebody trying to sort of think differently about how they react to other people and how they perceive other people in the world. So I've obviously cherry-picked a couple of quotes. Not everybody sort of found dramatic change, but I think these are things that if you were working specifically on people's cognitions, you'd be pretty pleased to see this kind of realignment of thinking. And this has come from a resolutely socially focused program. And I think kind of it does demonstrate that actually if you help people change their environment and their activities, that can lead to changes in people's thought processes and how they see themselves and their social worlds, which can be a real mechanism for reducing loneliness. So that's some of the promise of socially focused programs for loneliness, I think. I'd like to flag up a couple of what I think are key issues. So this is just me, but a couple of things that we certainly have grappled with in developing programs and thinking how to go about this. And the first one really is about what's the active ingredient, and there are perhaps a kind of couple of different ways that programs go about this. So befriending programs would really focus in on that relationship between the befriender and the befriendee as a sort of an important thing that improves people's social worlds, whereas more sort of social prescribing type approaches are all about linking people to activities in the community. So it might be that the linker and the person they're supporting don't have much in common, but they can still link people into stuff that's helpful. In terms of who provides support, I think there's a debate about whether you try and embed this within routine care. You get mental health staff to do more, to work in this kind of way with people more as part of standard care, or whether you need new workers who perhaps have different skills and have dedicated time who can provide this kind of support as an addition to standard care for people who are using mental health services. But there's a whole lot more as well as that, but from theoretical underpinnings to really practical things like how many sessions, how long should things be, do you need money, what kind of training do people need to do this work? And I'm not going to go into that to detail now, but it would be good to think about that. So we're going to move on in a minute now to thinking about this one example, and there'll be others to come from Domenico and Andrew and the other speakers about the Community Navigator study. So this is we've just got the results paper out from this study. It was only a feasibility trial that we've done so far, so no definitive evidence about is this an effective intervention, but we enjoyed doing it, and I think the participants, the qualitative feedback we got was good, and it's looking promising. Really briefly, what that involved was just a community navigator, so a sort of socially focused supporter, offering up to 10 sessions to help people in secondary mental health care in addition to their standard care, and doing perhaps 3 main things. So mapping out with people their social worlds, people, places and activities that were important to them, then helping them set some sort of goals or plans for what they wanted to do to sort of improve their social connectedness with others and to try and reduce loneliness, and then giving both practical and emotional support with enacting those plans and trying to achieve their goals. Key to this were the community navigators themselves. So without me chuntering on further, I'm going to hand over to Zubair, who worked as one of the community navigators on this study. And I'm going to ask him a few questions to try and tell us about how that was for him and what some of the key issues were that arose. This is Zubair's page that we had on the sort of public-facing bit of the Navigators study. Hi, so Zubair, can you hear me, and can we hear you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
Hi,
great.
Hi, Bryn, and hi, everyone.
Hi. Okay. So I think, first of all, that I've been talking about this study, but it'd be really helpful if you could give us a quick overview of what working as a community navigator on the project involved and the sort of things you were doing.
Yes. So basically, well, primarily it was one of developing relationships with socially isolated people, engaging with them to find pathways and options, enabling them to make connections, assisting them to overcoming and navigating through barriers and obstacles, and ultimately to reduce isolation and loneliness. We had up to 10, like you said, we had up to 10 sessions with each client, during a 6-month period. Each of the community navigators had 10 clients. We developed a simple mapping tool to identify the people, places, and activities that the client could value or find important in their lives. And it was really a good starting point for discussions. Equally important was goal setting, like you mentioned. It can be really useful, especially baby steps towards achieving them. We need to keep in mind the person's vulnerabilities may lie in past failings in achieving their own or other people's expectations and goals. So that was a very important consideration. The other part of it was the scoping in line with the desires, interests, and goals of the client is a major part of the role. Local knowledge, insight, connection, and even personal experiences is useful. So we need to do the basics, check into a place or activity before you go. Is it really suitable for the client? You know, issues like language, culture, disability needs. You know, the worst thing is to go to somewhere and find that it's a wasted trip. It just reduces confidence on all sides. The engagement must be on their terms. Explore, do not pry, which is very important consideration. Their intentions must always be paramount to avoid any misunderstandings. Now, we also provided, you know, it's very important that we provide emotional support, which is constantly praise and, you know, building confidence, be open, be honest, you know, allay any fears and concerns, recognize, but do not dwell on any past failings, which is very important. You know, use it as a part of learning. And the basic practicalities, Bryn, which is very important. Travel with the person to a new place rather than meeting them there. A quick coffee maybe to meet up for the day, you know, just to get the day started. Don't overburden them with lots and lots of activities or things to do. Be measured in your approach. Have a backup plan in case you go somewhere and doesn't work out. Very important that you adapt your adaptability. You know, they will cancel appointments, they will miss appointments. You know, you need to make sure they don't feel that, you know, it's a bad thing or something that you're upset with them. That was a very important part of our work. And a couple of other things. This was very important because, you know, we need to refer them to their support or care coordinator for assistance on issues that were beyond our jurisdiction, but was very important as part of our engagement. So issues like neighbor disputes, maybe benefit issues, maybe debt problems, they were very important in terms of what we could do, because that could actually, you know, be too much for them to do anything, because that was too burdensome, these issues. So we had to work with their care coordinators, but not take over that role. And the other last thing is that friendships do develop, but we need to avoid dependency. It makes the exit so much more harder if we don't create those boundaries throughout. And that was a very important of our consideration. So it was a healthy balance between being very personable with them, but also striking that part of being impersonal as well, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That's a lovely overview. I just got one eye on time, but just very quickly, Zubair, I wonder if you could say, were there any particular considerations you found in sort of working with people with severe mental health problems in the context of NHS secondary services that you had to bear in mind?
Yeah, it was very important because, you know, people were coming out of, you know, secondary services. Their needs were quite acute, and we need to be very, very considerate in terms of what their needs were in the community, because they were very isolated. We found them to be quite lonely, and the approach that we took was one that the goal setting needed to be very appropriate. For some people, we didn't even set any goals. We found that some people we couldn't even map anything on their mapping exercises. So we had to do things that were very much in line with their needs, of them coming out of, some of them had been sectioned in the recent past, and that was an important part of our consideration, that we need to take the whole part of their well-being into consideration.
Okay, thank you. And just from your experience overall, would you say there are any key things, any really kind of critical ingredients of the support you were offering, which you think any socially focused approach to loneliness really needs to take into account to be effective and helpful for people?
The thing was that we had lots of things that we needed to consider, which was the fact that the person that that becomes a community navigator, they have to have those skills and experiences and lived experiences, which is very important to actually managing the role. And we had that in the team that we built, and we also had a really, really strong multidisciplinary team around us that was able to provide us with that ongoing support and supervision that we needed in terms of managing the task, because it can be quite pressurizing, working with this client group. It's a very needy group, it's a very isolated group, and that was a very important part of the work that we had to do.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, and there will be more questions about that from people in the time to come, but thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hand over for the last bit, if I may, to Nick Barber, who is lived experience researcher colleague who worked again with us on the Navigators, who, Nick, if you can try and keep this to sort of 3 or 4 minutes would be ideal, really, but just to talk a little bit about some of the feedback we got from participants, which you helped to analyse in the qualitative data, and then a last bit about co-production on the study and how that helped. Can you hear us, and can we hear you, Nick?
Okay, am I on?
You're on. Hi.
Okay. Yes. Basically, we analysed interviews. Well, amongst others, we interviewed the participants. We interviewed the community navigators, and we interviewed clinicians. These are some quotes from the service users who had used the Community Navigator project, and they were very heavily positive, I would say, and I think this reflects the quality of design and execution of the project in total. Could we scroll on to the next slide? In a sense, it was interesting because it wasn't a straightforward intervention, because there was quite an ask from the service users themselves. I prefer the word ask to burden, because they were essentially, as Zubair said, they were very isolated and often quite unwell group of individuals, and yet taking part in the Community Navigator project required them to confront issues that they may have had, such as claustrophobia, agoraphobia, and that there was a certain degree of commitment and buy-in that they had to make right at the outset and then continue through the project. Fortunately, this paid off, because the amount of participation was extremely high, and I think that contributed, well, it contributed to this successful feedback, obviously. Could we go to the next slide, please? There were, however, obviously lessons learned. One of the main problems seemed to be the shortage of time and the lack of, basically each service user got 10 appointments each, and not all of those appointments were able to be met within the time frame available. there was a certain artificiality because it was a trial, and so in real life, as it were, it would be easier to extend the 6 months or what have you, so that they did get the 10 appointments. Basically, as it says here, if we had a longer time scale, things might have been even better than they were. Having said that, in the time scale that we had, I think we achieved quite a lot, and the qualitative feedback, as I say, was overwhelmingly positive. Next slide, please. I sat on the co-production group, which was very interestingly made up and unusual for these types of research. It was 1/3 researchers and academics, 1/3 clinicians, and 1/3 service users stroke carers. It was very well run. It was very well managed. We were set as a group a set of clear questions and objectives to answer, which were essentially practical aspects of running the Community Navigator program. For instance, the researchers came up with, I think it was 5 different mapping tools, and we were given an afternoon to play with each of these tools to see which ones worked best. And in the end, we ended up sort of cobbling our own mapping tool together from the tools which we had been given. Some of the tools we just rejected out of hand. We made contributions as to how to best approach language, use of terms that might be off-putting. We also were heavily involved in the recruiting and the specification and the interviewing of the actual navigators themselves. We made clear to the researchers that the way best to do this was not to look at paper qualifications or clinical experience, but there was a sort of an X factor, so to speak, which would set certain people apart. And it was to do with personability, it was to do with empathy, it was to do with communication skills. And so we chose our community navigators on the basis not only of their paper skills, but also on their person skills. And yes, I mean, we set tasks about finding local resources and things like this. We also set various parameters. For instance, there were ethical considerations to do with things like the budget, things to do with what the community navigator could get involved in and what they really ought to hand over to clinicians. We tried to negotiate as a tripartite committee, which was the researchers, the clinicians, and lived experience users. We tried to negotiate an ethical framework which the communicators, which the navigators could use to inform.
Nick, I'm really conscious of time, so I think we might have to stop there, but I hope that's given people a flavour of co-production on the project. And I think my experience is also that this was hugely valuable, and I hope it's given some things for people to think about. And thank you to you and Zubair very much.
Yeah.
Thank you all of you very much. It's a very enlightening presentation. Haven't got time for a lot of questions, but just one interesting question that's come up in the chat. You can perhaps also take a look at the other ones in the chat, but one you might want to comment on is whether you think, whether you have any idea or think it likely that change was sustained or might be sustained after this intervention.
So from my point of view, I think it's a limitation of the study we did that we don't know. We don't have any follow-up measures beyond the end of the intervention. I think in general, for perhaps the reasons I was talking about before, an intervention that's sort of about linking, about trying to tap people into things that hopefully they can go on using, has got more chance of having sustainable benefits for people than one which is about the relationship with some supporter who then leaves at the end of it and what happens then. So I hope so, but I think it's one of the things we really need to look at in a more definitive evaluation to come.